Lightfoot, did you come to join us? Is it because you know we're talking about emotional stuff and you're a good girl? Mwah. So, Seb is turning 1 this week on March 4th, and we thought that we would share a bit of our NICU experience from a year ago and what it was like during the pandemic being in the NICU. So, on February 29th, 2020, around 3 a.m., Luke and I went to the health center. The midwives had to come and get us because our truck was in the shop. And they determined that I was in preterm labor. We still don't know why. And I was going to need to be medevaced to Winnipeg. They gave me the first dose of steroids to help Sebastian's lungs, and they contacted the medevac team. Luckily they had just touched down in Rankin, so they were all pretty much ready to go, but unfortunately the plane had too much fuel for Luke to come with me. I was pretty upset with that. I remember as we were taking off in this teeny tiny little plane, just looking out the window and crying and praying that this baby wouldn't come before Luke could get there. And praying that this baby wouldn't come at all until it was ready. Because at that point I wasn't even 27 weeks. I was 26 and a few days. And I was pretty scared. But they were able to stop my labor in the air, which was awesome. Luke was able to get the next flight out. And this was all before COVID restrictions had kicked off. We were just sneaking in before that. Anyway, they kept me for observation for a couple of days, which was honestly not the best time. I know that people were overworked, but our experience being admitted was not great. Every new nurse or doctor who came in, we had to tell them our story all over again, it seemed like. There wasn't clear communication. We didn't know what was going on with me, why this was happening.
They tried to give you the same needle twice from 2 different nurses.
I don't remember that, but I'm sure I believe
you.
An
hour later, another nurse came back in and had the needle in her hand and was like, "Okay, we're ready to give you this injection." And we were like, "We just got that an hour ago."
Yeah, it was a little nuts. I got the second dose of steroids for Seb's lungs to help them develop 24 hours after the first one. And they put me on an antibiotic and couldn't tell me why. And they discharged us at 7 o'clock at night and gave me a number of a doctor to call the next day. And they said bed rest, but they didn't really explain what that was. Like, how strenuous. I don't know. They didn't explain bed rest. It's pretty self-explanatory, I'm sure, but like, I need limits. Anyway, within 24 hours, we were back at the hospital because I was in labor again. And where I had been admitted, they hadn't even sent my chart down to triage, so I had to go through all of my questions, the screening questions all over again, and I was pretty angry. And I made it very clear to every nurse and doctor that I encountered that this was not okay. This is not okay. I should not have been discharged. No one was telling me anything. This is not okay. So my experience after that was wonderful because The doctor explained everything as it was happening. They decided to put me on morphine to try and stop my labor, and they took me over to labor and delivery just in case. Luke had a bed on the floor. The morphine knocked me out for a little bit, but I was awake most of the night, and I was trying not to make a lot of noise because I wanted Luke to sleep because I knew he was tired. And around 4-ish in the morning, they let me know that they were giving me morphine again, but this time it was to help with the labor pain because this baby was coming. And he did, right before 6. I think it was 5:57 a.m. I was able to deliver him. They didn't need to do a C-section. And in came Sebastian to the world. For the first couple of hours, I wasn't able to see Seb because I fell asleep. And it took them a while to transfer me from labor and delivery over to postpartum, I think it is. I don't remember. I think postpartum. But Luke got to go with Seb right away. And got to go over to the NICU to see him all settled. He was able to do a video chat with me so I could still see Seb. At this point, he didn't have a name. We picked that after, didn't we? Yeah, he didn't have a name yet. But he was so tiny. He was 1040 grams, and I think 14 inches long, but I don't know. I didn't find that out his length until later, and I still can't remember how long he was. He was so small. So small. When I finally got to see him, I couldn't pick him up yet because he was just so little, and they wanted to make sure that he was okay. The first few days, the biggest problem seemed to be his lungs. From what they could tell at the time, it looked like his right lung was underinflating. So he started off the day on CPAP, but he ended up being intubated by the end of the day. And I think they may have switched him CPAP and then intubation again. He ended up being intubated for a couple weeks, I think. 2-3 weeks. I think 2. In the Winnipeg NICUs, they share doctors between the two hospitals, St. Boniface and Health Science Center. And every week, almost, you get a new doctor. So I think it was week 2, we got a new doctor who specialized in lungs. And he noticed that it wasn't Seb's right lung that was underinflating. It was his left lung overinflating. So that meant that he wasn't able to. His right lung was trying its hardest, it just couldn't. So he had Seb left side down for like a good week, I think it was. The nurses had a hard time trying to get Seb in different positions for his head, so he wouldn't get flat spots that way, but they figured it out. I think day 2 or 3 of his life, he got a blood clot in his right arm, and his hand went white. And in the next bed over, they were doing a procedure on another baby. So the doctor that would be able to take out his arterial line wasn't able to get to him right away. So by the time that they were able to take that out, his hand was black from tip to wrist. but the doctors there were great. Well, some were better than others, but they found research on treating that happening, and they took nitroglycerin spray like you use when for heart attacks or something. Yeah. And they treated his hand with it a few times a day, and in about a week or so, his hand had completely cleared up. We found out about a week after he was born. Was it a week or 6 days or so? I don't know. Whatever amount of days it is that they do the brain scan, like they wait, it's a certain amount of days that they wait, and then they do a brain scan with a ultrasound machine. So when this happened, they discovered that Sebastian had had a brain bleed. It was grade 3 on the left and grade 4 on the right, 4 being the most severe. So grade 3, it would have bled in the ventricle of the brain. Grade 4, it was the ventricle and some brain tissue as well. So we still don't know the extent of how that will affect him. And they like to say that babies' brains are plastic, so they are really good at rewriting themselves and coming up with different pathways for things. I'm seeing that he has more trouble on the left side of his body. But time's going to tell how much that will have affect him. Hearing about his brain was very difficult. We've gotten used to it all now, but it was very hard. All of it was hard. What made it all even harder was I was not able to hold Seb until he was a week old. The doctors they were unsure if they didn't think that he would be stable enough for that. But a week in, we got a nurse who is amazing. Nurse Diane. She is a huge advocate for skin to skin and the benefits that it does for NICU babies. She is amazing to talk to. She's a Wonder Woman. And she was like, no, you're holding your baby today. You are holding your baby today. It took 4 people to make it happen. They had 2 nurses holding him. He was still intubated, so there was respiratory therapists involved, everybody. I just sat there, and they brought him and laid him on my chest. And I got to hold my son for the first time. Whew. I held him for 4 hours. 4 hours, because I only got up because I had to go pump my breast milk out. But they did it real quick, so they picked Seb up. I hopped out and Luke hopped in. I think he did a total of 8 hours skin to skin that first day. Because he just wanted to hold him. Because we knew he was in pain. Whew. After that, I just did skin to skin hostings. Now, again, this was before COVID restrictions. This was before it hit Canada that hard. This was the first week of March, because Seb was born March 4th. So Luke had been with me this whole time. And the plan became that he was going to go back and work. And he would come down every couple of weeks from Nunavut. He'd come down and see us. So on day 8 of Seb's life. Luke held him for 4 hours. I was the one swapping in for the second 4-hour shift, and Luke went to the airport and he was gone. And it was just me. I was alone for a week. At this point, we were at the Ronald McDonald House, and that's where we stayed until we had to isolate to come back to Nunavut. I cannot say enough good things about the Ronald McDonald House. They are wonderful. They made my life so much easier. I didn't have to think about meals. I didn't have to worry about a high hotel bill. I could be around other people, and my needs were met. It was wonderful. Anyway, the Ronald McDonald House has a program with WestJet where they will fly family members across country to families who are staying in Ronald McDonald houses so they can be together. And through this program, my mom was able to come out from the East Coast and be with me. She stayed with me for a few months, I think, until May. May is when she went back. And again, she just squeezed in before the COVID shut everything down. She did wear a mask out, I remember that, but she didn't have to isolate when she came to the Ronald McDonald House. I was alone for a week, and then my mom was there with me, and around that time is when Nunavut closed their borders and made it so you had to isolate for 2 weeks before you came back into the territory, which essentially trapped Luke here in Nunavut with me down there.
No, because they wouldn't allow any new people in the Ronald McDonald House. That
too, yeah. They weren't going to allow people into the Ronald McDonald House either. That was shut down as well. So he would have had no place to stay. That was very hard. Anyway, the problems with Seb's head were not going away. The condition that he has, I don't know if it ever goes away. I think he might always have it. I don't know. Hydrocephalus. So, because of the brain bleeds, my understanding is the blood clots that developed from that blocked his natural pathways for brain fluid to drain down into his abdomen. And what was happening because of that is his head was swelling. Now, St. B, which is where we were, they don't have neonatal neurosurgery there. It happens at HSC. So we knew we would have to go to the other hospital. It was just becoming a timing thing. One of Seb's first doctors, she was fighting to get him into HSC. It was just a matter of space because the NICU was so full, and we were transferred the next day, so it was all fine. And he got the first surgery not too many days after that. In that month period between when he was born and when he was transferred to HSC, after about 2 weeks being intubated, he was switched to a high frequency CPAP machine. So it made a loud noise. It was, everything was loud. I just remember that being in the NICU, everything was loud. There's always alarms going off when their breathing dips or their heart rate goes up. There's just constantly sounds happening. But the high frequency CPAP was even louder, and what it did is it was pushing air in at a certain pressure. I don't know what word. but his little cheeks would go do, 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 with the air going. The poor darling. But they didn't have, I remember they didn't have high frequency CPAPs at HSC, so they had to get him conditioned enough to be on a regular CPAP by the time we got to HSC, and they were able to do that, which was awesome. And in that month at St. B, the COVID restrictions were getting more and more stringent. My mom initially was able to come with me. They have family room that she was allowed to be in. Well, actually, at first we were both allowed to be at the bed when she first got there. We were, both of us, allowed at the bedside. Then a few days later, it was one person at the bedside at a time. So she would wait in the family room. I'd go do skin to skin, and then when it was time to pump, and Mom would go in while I ate and just relaxed. Oh, I've got the hiccups. And then we'd switch back. And we'd spend the whole day there. Then they closed the family room. But she was still allowed in the hospital, so she would wait downstairs. And we'd still do our switching thing. I think a day or so before we were set to go, they were starting to change that, so she wasn't going to be allowed to be downstairs. But the day that they told her that she wasn't allowed to be downstairs was the day that we were transferring hospitals. So she got to, and that was the last day that she got to see Seb in person. So she saw him in the ambulance rig, and the ambulance rig for NICU babies is quite interesting because it's a whole regular size gurney, but then they have a NICU pod on top of it. Seb did not enjoy his ambulance ride very much. When we got to HSC, he was bright red because he was so mad. I missed a lot of things about the NICU at St. B. At St. B, you're in pods, and I think there was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 beds to a pod, but you're right there with other NICU families. So I could look over and see another mom or dad doing skin to skin while I was doing skin to skin with my baby. I can't remember who it was. Might have been, I don't know. There were other moms who have sent me messages since saying they remember me for singing, because I would sing to Seb a lot while we were doing skin to skin, and they would remember the songs that I sang as well. So there was just a sense of community. HSC was very different. They have a brand new women's hospital, and there's lots of cool things, but I miss that sense of community. And because it's a lot bigger at HSC, I didn't have the same nurses very often, if at all. Like some nurses I would have once, and that was it with Seb. So it was a lot harder to make connections. Oh, and we had individual rooms within our pods, which was cool for a lot of ways. I was finally able to spend the night because they had a pull-out couch in every room. I was able to decorate his little room as much as I wanted. They said treat it like a nursery, so I did, which was very cool. But it was much more lonesome at HSC. And as part of their COVID restrictions, they issued 2 bracelets to every NICU baby caregiver, and they were non-transferable. So if I had given one bracelet to my mom, even if she had gone back to New Brunswick, Luke wouldn't have been able to come in to see Seb when he eventually came down. So that was the last time my mom got to see Seb, and she hasn't seen him in person since. Which is, again, hard, especially for her, but it is what it is. So not long after we got to HSC, Seb had his first brain surgery. You have to be, the NICU baby has to be 2 kilograms minimum for a permanent shunt, which is what Seb has now. And he was not big enough, but the rate at which his head was swelling, he needed pressure relieved. So they put in a reservoir. I always pictured it as like, you know, like a sauce, like a little sauce container that you get for dip. I pictured it like that. I know it wasn't that, but it was a place that they could insert a needle and pull off fluid without doing a whole nother surgery. It reduced the risk of more brain damage. There was still some there, the fact that they had to put it in, but it made things easier for them. Before he was big enough for his shunt surgery, I think he had fluid drawn off twice. And I think that was April. He had his second surgery in May. So obviously this is a different day. Preparing this video about our NICU experience took a little bit more out of me than I thought, and it's taken a lot more time to edit than I thought, but I hope that it is helpful for some people out there. Now, between Seb's first surgery and his second, we were working on lowering his dependence on the CPAP. The way that the CPAP works for NICU babies is that it keeps the lungs pressurized to a certain degree. So the lungs never fully deflate. And what this does is makes it easier for the babies to work on breathing on their own. And you can set that pressure to different levels as the baby gets stronger. Now, Seb was doing well working his way down, but he was a baby that liked to have a lot of O2 and heart events, mostly O2. His O2 would just drop out of nowhere, and you'd get the nurses to come run to check on him, and then he'd be fine. It was almost like he was teasing them. He also would occasionally get lazy, which I'll talk about here in a second. He had his second surgery in May for the permanent shunt. They took the reservoir out and put the shunt in the same place. They even cut the same scar that they had cut before. And then they ran the tubing endoscopically just beneath his skin and down over his rib cage, and had the extra tubing down in his belly. They cut a little incision near his belly button so they could pull the tubing through a little bit more easily. And he has a lot of extra tubing in his belly, so hopefully, if all goes well with that shunt, it'll just grow with him and he won't need to have a shunt revision, hopefully. After that surgery, he had a lot of swelling, and they were slow to take him off of intubation. Now, what they didn't know at HSC is how he had acted on the vent at St. B, because oftentimes Seb would breathe over the vent, but then he would get lazy and just like, well, this machine's doing all the work for me, I might as well let it. And that he was doing that again after that surgery. They thought it might have been the morphine, but they weren't sure. He was getting, I don't know what builds up in the lungs, but something builds up, and they have to use some suction to get it out and clear the tube. And that was happening a lot, and they were concerned after that surgery if he'd be able to clear it on their own. But I advocated for him and said, yes, he will. But if you let him keep being on the vent, he is going to just rely on the vent because he can. And sure enough, when they took the tube out, he went right back on CPAP, no problem, just breathing the way that he'd always been breathing and coughing to clear his lungs when he needed to cough to clear his lungs. My silly boy. He had to be upright and off to the one side for a few days because they didn't want any brain fluid to leak out of his incision. But that all went well, and soon he was back to lounging on his back or his belly as he wanted to lay. So the next thing to tackle for him was getting him off CPAP and getting him eating, because his whole life he had been fed through a tube, whether that tube was in his nose or his mouth. I think with the CPAP it was mostly in his mouth. When he was ventilated it would be in his nose. But Seb had a very bad habit of yanking that tube out. He was very good at it. There was a bit of time we had to put mittens on him and tape the mittens to him so he couldn't grab the tube and yank it out. He would do it with his CPAP too. He'd yank it right off. Silly boy. He was working on coming off of the CPAP. They kept lowering his pressure. He needed to get to CPAP +5 or +4 for them to take him off. I think he made it to +4. They waited that little bit of extra time. And it was great. He came right off of it. His poor little face had dents on it because they have to strap it to their heads, because it's not like an adult CPAP machine where you can just strap it on there. No, it was tied to his head and pressed to hold it on his face. They would put little bandages or little sheep, some of them were shaped like sheep, to try to stop that. But it was really awesome watching his face while he looked around and didn't have something on his face. And it was so quiet because we were so used to the sound of the CPAP, but it was so quiet. He did awesome. Some babies have to go onto oxygen prongs when they come off the CPAP, their lungs still aren't strong enough, and some babies even have to go home with those. But Seb seemed to be doing fine. That was until his eye exam. NICU babies get an eye exam bi-weekly because they're born, especially when they're born as early as Seb was, they need to make sure that they aren't developing any eye diseases. They need to catch anything that develops quickly so they can deal with it before it becomes a huge problem. And it's quite the ordeal for a NICU baby, because you can't tell a baby, okay baby, look this way while I look in your eye, and then look this way. They have to force the baby to do those movements, and they do that by holding the eye open with an instrument and prodding the eye back and forth while they shine a light in. So it's quite the ordeal on a regular day. Seb's first eye exam after coming off of CPAP was good. It was clear. He didn't have anything that they were concerned about. They were developing nicely. But he got pretty tired. And it just so happened, the time that the eye doctor came, he had a feed right after that eye exam. And I don't know if it was because he was so tired or if he was just stressed out, but it did not go well. Between the first surgery and the second surgery, we were working on his feeding. They have a system that they work through in the NICU that is called Safe Individualized Nipple Eating Competence. And it has different levels that is helping a baby become an oral eater. Sync A, they just work with a soother. Sync B, they put drops of milk on the soother, and so on and so forth, increasing the volume depending on the baby's weight until they're eating as much as any other baby. And Seb had been doing great at this once Chris kicked his butt. Nurse Chris, Seb was being lazy, as he is, and she said, "Nope, sir, you are old enough that you should not still be on sync A, so we're going to work on this." And he had been progressing really well through the sync levels. And we were starting on breastfeeding, which is very hard. If you've never done it, breastfeeding is very hard, especially with a preemie. It takes time. Be patient if it's something you really want to do. So after his eye exam, he happened to have a feed, and I was breastfeeding him when he started to choke. And he had to be put on oxygen prongs because he was turning a little bit blue. It wasn't good. When he came off of CPAP, they also stopped giving him caffeine. NICU babies use caffeine to help keep them breathing, keep them going, and keep them energized enough, as far as I know. That's my understanding. And Seb stopped caffeine, and it was amazing. So they got the prongs in, and they gave him caffeine again. And at this point, it looked like he'd be going home soon. So they needed to determine if Seb needed to go home with caffeine medication or not. So Seb had a sleep study. And they determined that, yes, he has some permanent lung damage. It can get better with time and good nutrition. But right now it doesn't look great. But they did determine in the sleep study that he didn't need to go home with oxygen. But he might have to go home with the caffeine. He came off the prongs, but because of the fact that he was feeding when this problem happened, he developed an oral aversion. He wouldn't even take a soother in his mouth, much less a nipple or a bottle. It took a lot of work to even get him to take them again. But it soon became clear that this feeding problem wasn't going away. Seb was not eating enough. He was having to have most of his feeds still through his NG tube. Of course, he had been fed through a tube his whole life before we started oral feeding. Sometimes it was in his nose and sometimes it was in his mouth. He became very good at yanking them out because he didn't like them. But it wasn't going to go away on its own. He just wasn't doing enough. OT came and assessed him a bunch of times. They found a bottle that worked better for him. But it still wasn't enough. So it was time to consider feeding tube options. Because at this point, the only thing keeping him in the hospital was the fact that he wasn't feeding. Everything else looked good. He even developed enough in his lungs that in his second sleep study, they decided he didn't need caffeine anymore. It was awesome. Except for the feeding. It's really hard when your baby won't eat for whatever reason it is. You can tell that he's hungry and you're trying your best to feed him and he's just not succeeding. We had two options with the feeding tube. We could choose to go home with an NG tube, which is what he had, but the danger of that, he yanks it out all the time. I didn't know if we had someone here in Nunavut who knew how to insert NG tubes. So if he yanked it out here, we'd have to be back in Winnipeg, or we would have had to stay in Winnipeg indefinitely until he got better at feeding. Or he could have another surgery and get a G tube, There were two types of G-tube. One had a removable tube and just had a port that stayed there. And there was one that had an attached tube, but we didn't get the choice there. It would be up to the surgeon. We decided that the best option for us, the option that would let us come home and be safe at home, was to go through with the surgery. And so we did. It was the shortest surgery he had ever had. It was a lot like a piercing. They went endoscopically through his belly button to find the right place. And then they basically pierced it through his belly and into the stomach lining. And they stitched the edges just to help it stay in place. The stitches only stayed for a day or so. And then the stitches were out and you could twirl it all around just like you would with a new piercing to make sure it heals correctly around. We had training with the Sky team and with the amazing NICU nurses, so we could learn how to feed him and what supplies we needed and everything else that went with it. And we got to go home. After 127 days in the NICU, we got to leave. And it's so surreal when you're walking out of the hospital, walking out of the ward with your baby, because you feel like you're doing something wrong, but you're not. You're just taking your baby home, finally. Our journey wasn't over because we had to isolate for 2 weeks before we got home. And it took us a week to even get into isolation. But I arrived back home in Nunavut after 5 months to the day. 5 months to the day. And I was finally home with my baby. The one thing that made the NICU experience during COVID easier was the wonderful nurses that cared for Seb. It was a little bit easier to connect with the nurses at St. B because it was a smaller area and you could see each other all the time. And maybe because Seb was still so small, he ended up getting a same nurse for an extended period of time. I think I remember his first nurse, Ainsley, but the nurse that stayed with him for a 5-day stint was Jamie. And Jamie was awesome. I love you, Jamie. You're great. And at St. B, all of the nurses are called aunties. And it just made me feel like part of a family. It was a little bit of a culture shock going to HSC because there were new nurses all the time because they're so much bigger. Occasionally you'd get the same nurse, like Nurse Chris. Yeah, Chris, you're awesome. But a lot of times you were getting somebody new all the time. But there were awesome nurses like Nurse Chris who would come and check on you even when she wasn't assigned to your baby and would just take that time to listen to what you had to say. Another big challenge with COVID in the NICU is that you did not get to see your doctors as much. Having been in the hospital pre-COVID at St. B, they would come around every morning at 9 a.m. and do rounds. So you could be there while they talked about your baby, what had happened in the last 24 hours, and what their plans were going forward. You could ask questions. You were considered part of the team. By the time we got to HSC, full COVID restrictions were in place, which meant the doctors didn't come to your bed every day. They met in a different place to limit any exposure. But that took you out of being part of the team. They figured it out later and had a better system, but I went from being a big part of the team to feeling like I had to fight to just see my doctors. Some of that was on me because I didn't push as much as I should have. But I learned to push because I was Seb's advocate. Seb couldn't tell them what they needed, and because the doctor switched every week, I'm the one who had been through everything with him. I knew what worked better for him a lot of times than the doctors because I knew him. I had this lovely notebook and I wrote stuff down every day about what was happening with him, what was regular for him, the changes that they made. Because in the end, you are the parent. You know your kid better than anyone else in that NICU. Because you spend the most time with your kid. And even if you can't be there every day, I was lucky enough to be able to because he was my first son. I had no other kids at home to worry about. I was so far from home, I didn't have work to worry about. But even if you're only able to be there for short times, you still know your baby better than anyone else. So Seb will be 1 by the time this video is uploaded. And looking back now, the whole experience seems so surreal. And I can't believe how far he's come. This was a very long video, but I hope it was helpful to you in some way. And thank you for taking the time to watch our journey. See you next time. Hey Seb, do you like your cake?